Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we have the final iteration of the Destiny 2 endgame PvE shopping list. This time around, because it is the last time, of course, I will be trying to go into more detail on some of the reasonings behind why I would recommend some of these options for endgame PvE, maybe why I think some of them are higher priority compared to others. In each slide, we're going to have a description of what I think is generally the most applicable option for a specific use case, for like a weapon roll or for like an armor roll or something like that. And then I'll tell you where to get this weapon or armor piece from. And then I'll also offer some alternatives, which will describe not necessarily what I think are worse alternatives, but literally just alternatives. So I will explain them in context. Sometimes some weapons are strictly going to be worse than others within performing the same task, but sometimes you want a weapon for a different reason, even if that reason might be a less common use case than the most common one, which would be, of course, the header of the slide. And then I'll also include a specification section where I talk about what in particular you're looking for on this weapon or on this armor. So for armor, it would be like archetype and tertiary maybe. And then for a weapon, it would be obviously like the perks and maybe the origin trait or something like that. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Also, I have tweaked my mic settings because I know some of you guys were asking about that. So let me know if it's better this time around. Hopefully it is. In the outline here, I'm going to briefly talk about a preview of the priority brackets that I'm assigning to all these different weapons and armor. So in the high priority section, which is what we're going to be talking about first, used in a majority of endgame content, often the default pick for optimized play, fairly straightforward. Medium priority is going to be important in more specific endgame scenarios or maybe some powerful options that aren't like completely essential to endgame play. In low priority, we have stuff that's still irreplaceable for specific use cases, but very specific use cases, or more suited to like less optimized, more casual play. And then finally, as our fourth category, we have niche, which is outdated use cases. So maybe they were once good, maybe years ago, or potentially I can see a use case for them, but it doesn't really exist or pan out in realistic scenarios in endgame content as of this very moment. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with high priority. Our first role here is going to be ammo generation armor set bonuses. And in my opinion, the best one is going to be Christogreen or Europa armor, which, the best place to get that is going to be the Europa Master Lost sectors. And this one is, in general, like the best general play ammo generation armor set bonus. It makes orbs and doesn't require you to be in content that is very elite dense, like the Oryx's memory set does from King's Fall. However, you can, of course, run these two in tandem, so it's not like you have to pick one over the other. We have Pantheon Resplendent armor, which allows you to create that infinite special finisher loop that I've talked about in a couple other videos. We have Cyber Serpent Null, which is unique in that you can make special ammo off of just crystals. And then finally, we have Great Hunt armor, which is in theory maybe good with some sort of getaway artist build or another grenade spam build, but unfortunately in real use cases, you're probably just going to prefer running KF plus Europa instead of running 4-piece Great Hunt. Finally, the specifications for armor in this category are probably going to be Specialist, Gunner, Skirmisher, or Powerhouse archetypes, depending on what kind of other stats you're looking for, besides obviously 200 weapons. Next up, we have Damage Augmentation, in which you only have really two choices. The main one is going to be Atheon's Memory or Vogue armor, which allows you to produce an orb once every 5 seconds, as long as you score enough instances of damage on an enemy. We also have TM Custom from Spire the Watcher, which increases your swap damage or impact swap damage to weak spots to bosses by 7%. This is notable because some weapons, even though they're not precision/crit weapons, as long as you hit a boss directly in the crit, apparently this also increases your damage to a small degree, to 7%, compared to if you had not been using the set bonus. Now, specifications wise, you should almost exclusively be looking at Powerhouse plus class tertiary sets. Sometimes there are other classes where maybe you want grenade stat instead of, weapons class super, but that is typically not very common. Even on Titan and Warlock, I would say typically speaking, you're looking to get weapons super and class. Coming up next, we have General DR from 2-piece set bonuses, and the highlighted feature here is going to be Promised or SE set bonus, and that is of course going to give you 25% DR for 12 seconds upon killing an orange bar, which is obviously pretty good and gives you high uptime in a lot of especially more difficult content where orange bars are pretty common. The other armor set bonuses here to talk about are going to be Smoke Jumper, which is particularly good if you are generating orbs very quickly, which is not very hard in this sandbox. We have Ion Adapter, which gives you a high amount of splash resist for using a meta weapon like a Rocket Pulse. And then, of course, we have Yearning Echo from Grasp of Avarice, which provides a technically stackable DR set bonus. However, this is a little lower uptime because if you ever have your shields break, you do lose quite a bit of your stacks. And so that is going to make the DR uptime of this set bonus not not as good, especially when you consider that it only really stacks to like 15% realistically speaking, and so that's just not that great compared to some of the other set bonuses here. Specifications wise, of course, you're looking for specialist, gunner, skirmisher, or powerhouse, but of course this is going to vary heavily depending on what you're looking for in your build. Next up, we have Hunter DPS. The exotic of choice here is of course going to be Celestial Nighthawk by default, which you can get from Rahul, but there are 5 other exotics that are potentially relevant for endgame meta DPS. We have Fortune's Favor for non-goldy DPS, Orpheus Rig for more casual bow use cases where you might not have Void Overshield, Mask of Bacchus for stasis and arc damage stacking, Speedloader Slacks for super spam by getting Dynamo and distribution procs to farm up a Blade Barrage pretty quickly, and then of course we have Knucklehead Radar, which is occasionally used for final stand swaps in harder challenge content. Next we have Heavy DPS Sniper. This is going to be, of course, the refurbished A499. There's only one option here, and the source is going to be Territorial Prophet, which is, of course, the spider quest that you can do once a week, which guarantees you 1 shiny tier 5 drop in all 3 of your characters. We have specifications-wise a utility first column, so you can pick really anything like Lone Wolf, Bewildering, Snapshot. It's kind of up to you. And then, of course, we have Aggregate Charge, which is absolutely essential. Sometimes Envious Assassin can come up in some rare use cases. Like, for example, I've heard of people using it in Gauss second encounter with Gut Shot Straight in order to obtain 3 shots of high body shot damage, which allows you to one-shot all 3 of the angelics with damage buffs. And then, of course, you want the shiny if possible, which is still obtainable in the Monument of Triumph update, which gives you a free 6% more damage once you have the perk active. Next, we have a DPS rocket. Now, DPS rockets right now, Hezen Vengeance is easily the best one from Vault of Glass, but there are some alternatives here like the Hothead and Cynosure, which both provide you with Envious Aggregate and Accelerated Assault, as well as the When and Where, which is maybe a little bit of an option you can use for proccing Reaper's Tithe and getting Frame of Reference stacked in order to do a little bit of burst damage. Unfortunately, Hezen Vengeance is just the best one, so the alternatives here are strictly alternatives. They're not really like, oh, it's a different use case. You would basically always be using Hezen if you're trying to do rocket DPS. Specs wise, you're looking at cluster, autoloading, and overflow in the first column, with Envious being the least frequently used option. And then you have aggregate, honing, and bipod, with the occasional lasting swap for maybe certain solo options where you can't get enough honing stacks and you certainly can't get enough aggregate stacks. We're going to prefer getting a time lost Hezen because of the bipod swap interaction. For those of you that don't know, if you rally on bipod and let's say you have 14 rockets and then you use 5 of those rockets and you end up with 9 bipod rockets, if you swap to a normal damage perk like aggregate, you will still have full ammo because 9 out of 14 doesn't get proportionally converted. It just cuts it off and you just have 9 rockets, which can be quite useful. There's a bunch of useful interactions that are a little niche but can come in handy when it comes to having bipod as a swappable perk on your rocket. And so that's why I'm going to be recommending the time lost version for this specific rocket. Next up, we have Kinetic DPS Sniper. This one's going to easily go to Conspiracy Hone due to its insane damage profile compared to your standard legendary sniper. This one's going to come from Equilibrium, pretty easy to farm from there. And in alternatives, you have Praetus Revenge for Synthesis Abuse in order to have basically infinite kinetic special ammo. We have Something Something, which is same as above, unfortunately doesn't roll with Accelerated Assault anymore. And then finally, Lance Ephemeral, which is a strand option. If you want strand for whatever reason, maybe for honing on your rocket, Lance Ephemeral is there. And then specs-wise, you're going to be looking for Vorpal plus Bait and Switch or Firing Line, depending on what kind of rotation you're doing. You're going to be looking for Ionized Heatsink, and then of course the Heat-generated Masterwork. Compared to most weapons, Conspiracy Honed is extremely roll sensitive. The only thing that doesn't really matter is going to be your barrel, but everything else does matter when it comes to optimizing your damage and getting the highest number of shots you can get out from this sniper. Next up, we have Kinetic Rocket Pulses. Now, this only has one option, which is going to be Mint Retrograde, very important for ad clear in higher level content, which you can get from Pinnacle Ops. Specs-wise, you're looking at Field Prep typically for ammo gen. Beacon Rounds is optional if that's something you prefer. You have Master of Arms, Frenzy, Chain Reaction, and of course you have Slice in the second column, which can be good with certain Strand artifact mods. However, Slice is only obtainable on the old version of Mint Retrograde, which you can't get from Pinnacle Ops, which I believe you can only get from the weekly engrams at Hawthorne. Next up, we have Energy Rocket Pulses. There's 2 of these, Valentif D easily being the superior of the 2 from SRL. also very important for ad clear. This one, the alternative is going to be Psi Eterna 4, which in my opinion, even on an arc build, I would probably rather run Valentive, unless you're maybe like surge matching or you're like looking for something to save on your scav ammo slot economy or something like that. But realistically, you're almost always going to be using Valentive. It's significantly better because it has air trigger and a higher base ammo gen stat. You can run heal clip as well if that's something you're looking for, and you can also run splash and spree perks like incandescent or maybe like desperate measures. Coming up next, we have exotic burst special weapons. Still Hunt is going to be the king here, especially if you're playing Hunter, which tends to be the most endgame meta subclass for especially raid and dungeon harder content where damage tends to matter. You can of course get this from an exotic quest, and alternatives, these are all used for different sort of burst special scenarios. Particle impetus melt from Merciless is pretty helpful for mini bosses. The fourth horseman is good for just not a care in the world, just barrel stuffing a boss without, really aiming too much. Izanagi's burden is good for pre-aiming if you're not on Hunter or Celestial Nighthawk. Tessellation is good, of course, for splash damage, and Heirloom is very ammo efficient, but requires you to kind of preempt and hold ADS on a target where you know it's going to spawn for a long period of time. Next up, we have Exotic Debuff. This is very important in fireteam damage scenarios. You have Tractor Cannon, which you can get from an exotic quest. I believe if you're a new light, you kind of just get this exotic off rip, so everyone should have Tractor Cannon. You have Divinity for creating a consistent crit on more annoying bosses where precision strategies are good, but the boss is moving around a lot. And then you have Fafnir for longer range enemies where Tractor isn't really as realistic. Next up, we have Exotic DPS buff, so providing buffs to your teammates. Gjallarhorn is going to be the best one here because typically speaking, the most meta damage options that require you to buff your teammates are going to be, in fact, rockets. You have Hierarchy of Needs, which can technically buff crossbows, but is much more annoying to set up given that you need 3 people for optimal damage, and then they can swap off Hierarchy, and then the rings will disappear at some point. So definitely a little bit more annoying to set up compared to Galley. You have Darcy for buffing Conspiracy and A499, which is a little bit overrated in my opinion. It's not as necessary as people think it is, but it is certainly helpful in fireteam sizes of 6. And then you have Ergo Sum, which allows you to provide Pack Hunter to other sword users, definitely essential if you're doing sword damage. We have Edge of Action, which is a little micro optimization, allows people to get a slight increase to their damage with that 5% stackable damage bonus. And then you have Turncoat, which has recently been found to buff the explosive portion of rocket damage, which can definitely help a little bit with optimized rocket DPS, but still typically very niche. And of course, you're giving up Still Hunt burst damage if you're going to use Turncoat, which means the rotation that you have in mind better be worth it, given that you're giving up such a big amount of damage off the rip. Next, we have Exotic Roam weapons. First off, I'm going to be picking Choir of One just because of how versatile it is. Of course, you can get this from the Encore Exotic Mission. Choir of One has a lot of range, something that a lot of the weapons that are listed in the alternative section don't have. It's hit scan, of course. It has that burst mode as well if you hip fire. Choir is just very versatile, and of course it performs excellently with the artifacts this season, which heavily favor Void auto rifles. In the alternative section, we have Praxic Blade, which is of course extremely consistent, but it's a melee option compared to Choir, and requires you to adopt a maybe slightly more risky playstyle, even though the weapon is of course very consistent even at that range. Dead Messenger provides you with more ammo gen and burst, but struggles with airborne targets, and obviously is a little less precise with his ammo usage and not as good for dealing with objectives. Ergo is good for arc conductor builds, which surprisingly scale fairly decently into very difficult content. You have Gjallarhorn for raw splash if you're willing to give up your heavy slot and maybe run something like Rain of Fire or Speedloader slacks. We're looking at stuff like Master Lost Sectors. And then of course you have Wave Splitter, which is excellent with the trace mods in the artifact, specifically Trace Evidence from the Tablet of Ruin artifact. Now specifications wise for Choir, a lot of people ask this, you're going to be looking at definitely Alloy Mag and Onslaught, given that you can easily get volatile rounds from the artifact, and Subsistence doesn't really do much for you when you have stuff like Sustained Fire and Targeting Autoloader. Next in the high priority category, we have Exotic Sustained Heavy Damage. Now the best thing here is going to be Truth, which I believe you can get from the Exotic Kiosk, but of course the alternatives, you have Leviathan's Breath if you're willing to use Mobius Quiver on Void Hunter, a bit more range, crit. You don't need any sort of setup, for example, getting Reaper's Tithe or Prototype Truth Seeker procced ahead of time. You have 1000 Voices, which is definitely less DPS, but easy splash damage, doesn't require any crit, and of course applies its own particle debuff without having any sort of tether or tractor. You have Wolfsbane, which is a legendary sword alternative, Lament, which is also a legendary sword alternative, and Acrius finally, which is also a legendary sword alternative. Next up, we have our medium priority section, and the first thing we're going to talk about is the armor. So ability regen can be helpful. However, it's a little bit more niche compared to typical content. In most endgame content, you're going to be looking just to produce a lot of ammo or to have a lot of survivability. Ability regen from the Grasp set, for example, can definitely be helpful, and it has some niche applications in speedrunning as well, on top of being great with, for example, like Stasis Titan, if you're doing the Howl of the Storm build in an ultimate level activity. But generally speaking, this is just a little bit more niche and less prioritized than the other armor set bonuses that we've mentioned so far. So Yearning Echo from Grasp of Avarice, obviously excellent for increasing the efficacy of elemental pickups. You have the Coda set bonus from Prophecy, which provides you with a lot of DR on top of chunk ability gains, which is better for non-elemental pickup based ability builds. You have Sage Protector, which provides you with class and grenade ability gen, but it's sword specific, so if you're running a sword build, that may be of interest to you. And then you have Luminipotent Armor, which is obviously very good on builds like Arc Warlock. Specifications wise, I'm going to say typically you're going to go for Powerhouse plus Grenade on a set bonus like this, but what you choose to end up going might depend on your build as well. Next, we have general DR, but 4-piece set bonuses. Now, 4-piece set bonuses are typically outclassed by 2-piece set bonuses because a lot of the 2-piece set bonuses provide you with enough DR to live, like a decent amount of DR. For example, you can just run like SC plus KF, which is a very common combination. And so it's a little bit more restrictive on your loadout when you run a 4-piece set bonus, especially given that the amount of DR that the 4-piece set bonuses tend to give isn't exactly 2 times the amount that a 2-piece set bonus would give you. That being said, I say the Nessus set bonus, which you can get from Master Lost Sectors, of course, on that planet, is pretty good. Exodus Down provides you with basically permanent 25 to 30% DR as long as you get a special finisher at some point or you're using like Powerful Attraction to pick up multiple orbs. Alternatives wise, you have Coda, which if you're willing to use a swap playstyle where you're using multiple weapons together to get kills, or you have a weapon that has like Headstone and Firefly or Conditional Finality or something like that, Coda is allowing you to get a ton of DR and also a ton of ability energy as well, even higher than Exodus Down. You have Deep Explorer, which allows you to survive high incoming damage scenarios where you're maybe not necessarily getting as many kills. But that being said, this is definitely more niche than Coda and Exodus Down. You have Techian's Regalia, which gives you passive DR. It's not that much DR, but you basically don't have to work for it as long as you don't die. And so that can be useful in some cases potentially. You have Oryx's Memory. If you're already running 2-piece King's Fall, you could try running 4-piece King's Fall, and the Invis is definitely helpful given how often you end up killing orange bars in a lot of endgame content. And then finally, you have Swordmaster 4-piece, which gives you an absolutely insane amount of DR if you play around glaive blocking, Praxic Blade blocking, etc. Specs wise, you're looking at maybe Specialist, Gunner, Skirmisher, or Powerhouse Armor, but again, it's going to depend on your specific build and what stats you're prioritizing. Next up, we have Hunter Roam Exotics. The first thing we're going to look at here is Relativism. Relativism offers you a lot of versatility when it comes to what perks you might want to pick on the exotic class item. You have Hoyle, Assassin, and Renewal in the first column, and Certarachne, Verity, and Syntho in the second column, all of which have their own use cases. Alternatives wise, we have Gifted Conviction, which is good for Tempest Strike builds, and also you can use it on regular Ascension spam builds on Priz Hunter as well. You have Radiant Dance Machines, which gives you a lot of utility when it comes to spamming clones with exotic primaries. You have Fortune's Favor, which is just a good general pick. If you don't know what to run on Hunter and you just want to shoot things with weapons and not die, Fortune's Favor is certainly a decent option off the rip. And then you have Mask of Bacchus, which is a little underrated pick that I like, which provides you an arc and stasis stacking damage boost, which provides you a stacking arc and stasis damage boost. And this damage boost is so potent that I think it is worth mentioning because the damage bonus that you get from this exotic effect is just so high that it's just such a big outlier. And Priz, Stasis, and Arc Hunter have survivability tools that don't necessarily need to come from the exotic. And so just being able to spam your class ability and keep high light shift stacks while getting this high damage boost is potentially worth looking into for high level content featuring Hunter Roam. Next up in our medium priority bracket, we have Titan Roam. Now, as you can see, Titans have a lot of exotics that make sense to use with their builds. I think most people agree that Worm God is still the generally strongest Titan exotic. You can use it with a bunch of different Titan builds, from Throwing Hammer to you can even use it with Howl of the Storm if you want. But generally, people are going to prefer something like Synthos, especially because Synthos buffs your super damage. For Thunderclap builds, you have Point Contact Cannon Brace, which is able to get a full refund of Thunderclap, I've been told, if you have high FPS. An Insurmountable Skull Fort is a no FPS requirement alternative, of course, that people are very familiar with. You have Stoicism, which gives you access to like Hoyle Syntho Consecration. Hallowfire Heart, which not only provides you some benefit if you're doing a Throwing Hammer build, but also allows you to have access to a sustained damage super. You have no backup plans, which of course has been touted as a pretty prominent pick with Slayer's Fang, with the artifacts available to us this season. And then of course you have Stronghold with Praxic Blade, a classic combo that has been criticized for being played too defensively, but you can play offensively with the Praxic Blade and Stronghold and have some impact and be very, very consistent at surviving. It's just obviously dependent on your playstyle. Specs-wise, we're looking at the Skirmisher or Paragon armor for Wormgod specifically, with probably a Grenade Tertiary. Next up, we have Warlock Rome. Now, the best exotic here was definitely pretty contested, but I went with Verity's Brow. Warlocks, obviously, their turrets and their actual grenades have frequently been the strongest in the sandbox, and with mods like Sticker Shock available to us in the current artifacts, Verity's Brow has been brought to a whole new level in terms of just nuking things with grenades that have very high uptime. Now, alternatives-wise, we have Winter's Guile, which I think is a pretty cool pick with Lightning Surge. You have Dawn Chorus, which is an excellent user of Solar Fulmination. We have Boots of the Assembler, which, much like Hellfire Heart, provides great neutral benefits if you're playing Solar Warlock, but is also well suited to the fragments and aspects that you tend to use if you're planning on being a well Warlock user during a raid or dungeon. We also have Getaway Artist, which I couldn't fail to mention. Obviously, the Facet of Dominance nerf definitely hit this thing a little bit hard, but with enough artifact support, it's still a pretty decent lazy damage option for ad clear. And then we have Geomag Stabilizers, which is worth a mention because of the Ionic Trace Luminipotent spam build. I think a lot of higher level players prefer the Verity arc build over the Geomag arc build, but it's still pretty good and I thought it was worth mentioning. The specs on the Verity build, you're probably going to be looking at Gunner plus Super Tertiary, but again, this might depend, especially if you are changing exotics off of Verity. Next in our medium list, we have Warlock DPS. Warlock DPS, the best general exotic if you're not thinking about teammates, is going to be Sanguine Alchemy because of the 10% debuff effect that it provides that stacks with everything else in the game for enemies that you damage, including ability damage, of course, and the 4x surge effect that it provides to you when you're standing in any rift or well. Alternatives, of course, Boots of the Assembler is the best team play well Warlock exotic, providing everybody with a permanent, basically 35% damage bonus, as well as refunding your class ability very frequently. You have Winter's Guile, which allows you to have a very high damage Song of Flame. You have Matiodoxia, which is good for pure damage, but a lot of people are taking this over Sanguine on Strand when they shouldn't be. So just be aware that Sanguine Alchemy outdamages Matiodoxia over a medium to long-term damage phase, whereas Matiodoxia is only good for that initial super burst if you're planning on using it on a very short damage phase. Dawn Chorus for ignition-based damage, whether it's ignition-based weapons or ignition-based abilities. You have Apotheosis Veil for some sort of Pack Tactics Threadling spam build. You have Fellwinter's Helm for range debuff, which I suppose is an alternative to the debuff options we mentioned in the previous section, Tractor, Divinity, and Fafnir, but obviously requires more coordination and for you to have an ad ready with like a chair finisher. And then specs-wise, you're probably looking at Powerhouse plus Class Tertiary, like you are for pretty much all DPS armor. Coming up next, we have DPS Crossbow. Now, DPS Crossbow, the only real option here is going to be a good shout from the Tenet of Bravery. Submersion does work with Bacchus, which can make it potentially interesting, but you're choosing to drop something like Mobius Quiver then. And then, of course, no Envious Arsenal makes this a lot harder of a pill to swallow as well, so I'm not saying you should farm for Submersion by any means. Specs-wise, on a good shout, you want heavy or charged or serrated bolts, but realistically, you're going to be going for heavy bolts. You want Envious Arsenal, you want High Ground, and then you preferably want a shiny, even though it's not available anymore. If you have a shiny, you should definitely keep it if it has these perks. You might be wondering why the DPS Crossbow isn't in the high priority section, despite being very ranked high on the Sustain tab. The Sustain tab simulates you getting all the ignitions from 3 hierarchy rings, and the math may not scale perfectly with stuff like Mobius Quiver, and so we'll do more testing in the future, but the amount of setup that it requires to get 3 hierarchy rings going in a fire team to empower this damage rotation, I do think rockets are just generally more applicable, and so even though this has a very high damage potential, a good shout, I do think it is a medium priority weapon. You're typically not going to be taking this on a lot of bosses compared to rockets, which are much more applicable and easy to set up for. Next in the medium priority category, we have kinetic DPS shotguns. This one is obviously going to be threat level from Pantheon. This one has access to a crazy amount of perks. Alternatives wise, we have Heritage, which is good for a Cascade dump as well, with stuff like Cascade Aggregate. We have Perfect Paradox, which allows you to get a nice fast 1-2 punch proc with Song of Flame, and Cast No Shadows for that partial shotgun refill. And then you have Until Its Return, which is a strand option. Not that I really recommend it, but I suppose it's an alternative worth mentioning. And then specs wise for threat level, you're looking at Cascade or 1-2 Punch in the first column, and All-Star, Trench, or Chaos Reshaped in the second column, with a preference for Shiny so that you can use the Forge's Kin Bug, which uses Origin Trait swapping. If you don't know what that is, we'll talk about that in a future video, probably in the Origin Trait tier list or something like that. But just know that the Shiny is preferred, so you have both Origin Traits to swap to. Coming up next, we have Energy DPS Shotgun. This one's a little less important, but the one that's easily been highlighted in most people's loadouts these days is Found Verdict from Vault of Glass. Alternatives-wise, you have Unvoiced from Sunder Doctrine with some redirection swap potential for rotations. You have Felwinter's Lie, which has access to Cascade and a damage perk in the form of Bait and Switch. You have A Sudden Death, which has 1-2 Punch and Trench Barrel combined. And then you have Arcane Embrace, which provides you with some sustained damage, as well as gives you a very fast way to proc Cascade Point for something like a threat level rotation. Specs-wise on Found Verdict, you're looking at Assault Mag with Aggregate Charge, maybe a Discord swap. You have Trench Barrel, 1-2 Punch, Honing, and Gear Shift in the second column, all of which have their own level of viability, but most people are definitely looking at Aggregate Trench, maybe Aggregate Honing, and Aggregate Gear Shift as well. Coming up next, we have Kinetic Rocket Sidearms. High Albedo is going to be the pick here from Europa. High Albedo might be the first kinetic special add clear archetype. We don't have a kinetic, like literal kinetic rocket pulse. So Kinetic Rocket Sidearm is as close as it gets, which is the only special add clear archetype that allows you to take advantage of the kinetic weapon damage boost to unshielded targets. Kinetic special weapons in particular do 15% extra damage to non-bosses just for free. And so pretty nice for a High Albedo to essentially have a free frenzy level damage perk over Tenacious and the Call. Tenacious Mastery is accessible for Chill Clip, and the Call has Slice as well as Dealer's Choice if those are of interest to you, but by default my recommendation for Kinetic Rocket Sidearm is going to be High Albedo. This thing has Bewildering Burst, which is very, very helpful for blinding enemies. You have Lead from Gold, you have Stopping Power. In the second column, you have Kinetic Tremors, Desperate Measures, Ancillary Ordnance, and All-Star, different options which you would take in different scenarios. Next up, we have Energy Rocket Sidearms. The number one pick here is definitely going to be Lotus Eater, given the amount of void support we have in the artifact this season. The source of Lotus Eater is, of course, Pinnacle Ops, and alternatives-wise, you're looking at Return Memory with Heal Clip, Tenacity, Redirection, Indebted Kindness with Attrition Orbs and a variety of useful utility perks, Aberrant Action with Radiolaria Transposer, basically the same role as Return Memory, just no redirection, and instead a better Splash Origin trait. And then finally, for the Energy Rocket Sidearm specs for Lotus Eater, we're going to be looking at Repulsor, Air Trigger, and Dimensional in the first column, Shoot to Loot if you have it on the old version, as well as Destabilizing, Surrounded, Withering Gaze, and maybe Collective Action in the second column for a neutral roam perk. Next up, we have Kinetic Shoot to Loot primaries, which are used often in challenges, for example, for picking up Still Hunt and Rocket ammo in something like Solo Witness. Now, my default recommendation here is going to be Vulpecula from the Shattered Throne, but in the alternatives section, you'll notice that Service Revolver and 7th Seraph Officer Revolver are essentially identical. They are the same frame, they have slightly different, gun models, so just pick whatever you want, really. You also have Corundum Hammer from Trials, which is a lower RPM version with the same role. Malediction, which is an even lower RPM version, so it's a little less preferred. You have Hung Jury SR4, which is the fastest firing kinetic scout with this option. And obviously specs-wise, you're just looking at Shoot to Loot, Explosive Payload, and High Handling to make it so that when you swap to this weapon, it feels a little bit better compared to a lower handling option. Next up, we have Energy Shoot to Loot Special Weapon, and of course, unfortunately, the number one pick here has to be Lotus Eater with its high ammo count and extremely large blast radius, and no requirement for Explosive Payload in order to pick up bricks and orbs in a large radius. Now, unfortunately, this version of Lotus Eater is no longer obtainable, so if you want an alternative that has some sort of explosive payload, you're going to have to look at something like Apostate, which has Shoot to Loot Explosive Payload, can be obtained from the Altars of Sorrow. You have Chronophage, which has no splash, but a high fire rate. Retrace Path, Carriunios, and Path of Least Resistance are all also Shoot to Loot energy traces that can be used for the same use case. Specs-wise on Lotus Eater, you're going to be looking at Shoot to Loot plus Withering or Destabilizing rounds, and ideally maybe high blast radius. Next up, we have Kinetic Traces. Kinetic Traces, you're going to be looking at Unsworn by default from Sunder Doctrine with its excellent origin trait and great perk spread to combine with Trace Evidence. Alternatives, you have Incisor, which has no Shoot to Loot, but instead features Slice, which is pretty nice. You have Action Item, which also has no Shoot to Loot, but has better Stasis neutral perks than the other two traces here, if you want to be on Stasis. And then specs-wise, for the Unsworn, you want Shoot to Loot or Tear in the first column, and Chaos Reshaped, Detonator Beam, or Hatchling in the second column to pair with Strand Artifact perks on Tablet of Ruin. Coming up next, we have the energy traces, which have a lot more options. Chronophage is going to be my number one pick here just because it has access to radiolaria transposer, repulsor, destabilizing, shoot to loot, etc. And you can, of course, get this from Encore. Now, alternatives-wise, we have Hollow Denial, which if you're able to get destabilizing rounds from the artifact, has a pretty good origin trait in the form of Extrovert, and also has insane ammo gen compared to Chronophage. We have Retrace Path, which has Incandescent, Acacia's Dejection, which has no shoot to loot option, but has Burning Ambition for maybe like Dawn Chorus Hellion builds. You have Cariunios, which uniquely has Chain and Detonator, both as perk options. You have Path of Least Resistance, which has Volt Shot, and Traces are famously pretty good Volt Shot weapons. And specs-wise, on Chronophage, you're looking at, like I said earlier, Repulsor or Shoot to Loot in the first column, and Destabilizing and Desperate in the second column. Next up, we have movement GLs. Now, movement isn't for everyone, but you don't really need to learn any crazy movement tech to make good use of Gizmo Weft when it comes to transitions, and even players who don't consider themselves speedrunners in endgame content, if you're just moving from place to place, having access to a crazy vertical boost through a micro-missile GL is certainly welcome in anyone's loadout. And so Gizmo Weft is going to be my pick here from the Tenet of Bravery, very, very easy to farm, and specifically has access to Bipod, which the Odolite in the energy slot, that's exclusive to the energy slot, of course, no other micro missiles in the energy slot, so no competition there, but generally when you're on a transition loadout, you're not super picky about what slot your micro missile occupies, and so Gizmo Weft is going to be the pick generally speaking. You have the Mountaintop, which I suppose has a kinetic damage boost to unshielded targets like we mentioned earlier, but you know, that's not really relevant, and typically you're just going to be going Gizmo because Mountaintop doesn't have Bipod. You have a Lethanim, which is technically an exotic, but is the only primary option if you're out of ammo, so I guess you should have that in your arsenal. And specs-wise on Gizmo Weft, I think everyone's aware, but you should have Air Trigger and Bipod, and try to achieve some high handling and reload through the rest of your weapon roll. And of course, we couldn't talk about movement GLs without talking about their natural pairing, which is of course movement swords. Movement Swords Falling Guillotine is, in my opinion, maybe the highest utility, like Vortex Movement Sword from Onslaught, of course, because it has Attrition Orbs, but the Slammer is fine too. Cold Steel, False Idols, another Vortex has Chaos Reshaped. Sullen Claw is a lightweight that can also be used for DPS. Terciopelo, this one is a lightweight, has Chaos Reshaped. Nazredin, lightweight with Flash Counter, a little bit more utility. You have Ergo, which is used for, it's a special sword. You can use it for micro-optimizing your movement a little bit. And then you have Praxic Blade, which has Hyper Blade, another sword you can use for kind of micro-optimizing your movement a little bit. And a lot of people get up in arms about, which Eager sword you should be using. But realistically, you want one with a Vortex frame and one with a lightweight frame. And then, if you want to use Ergo or Praxic to do some sort of neutral movement, you can do that too. But really, you just need a Vortex and you just need a lightweight. The one that you pick doesn't really matter that much. But of course, I'm going to recommend Falling Guillotine a little bit because it does have Attrition, which allows you to make orbs off of a heavy attack very quickly. And of course, you just need enough ammo to reach max ammo, which I think is 77, on Falling Guillotine. With backup mag. Next up, we have exotic burst heavies, which are a little less relevant these days. The best one is going to be Parasite because it boosts your special weapon damage and has a very high damage per shot, very instantaneous as well for encounters like Atrax. You can of course get this from the exotic quest of Queens and Worms, I believe. And then alternatives, you have Whirling Ovation, which can be used for Final Stand. It also does pretty high damage per shot, but requires some charging, and of course has that anticipation meter mechanic, which you can use it for encounters maybe like Caretaker or Explicator, where you have some sort of multiple plates, multiple small damage windows where you need to do burst. And then Grand Overture, which has lower DPS than Parasite, but I believe still has slightly more total damage, which if you don't have Parasite for whatever reason, you can use Grand Overture instead, and you'll do slightly, maybe less optimal DPS, but it can be used in encounters like, Morgith and Caretaker and stuff like that. Coming up next, we have Miscellaneous Neutral, the first entry into our low priority category, and that's going to be Nezarek's Nightmare with his ability to get Devour on Orange Bar plus finishers from Brood of Nightmares. Alternatives, you have Iron Battalion, which can be good for super recycling using stuff like Well. You have Iron Panoply, which gives you a combination of ammo generation and damage resistance. You have Sage Protector, which allows you to hit some crazy long-distance skates using Blade Focus, as well as having some other small applications in speedrunning. And then finally, you have TechSec, which provides an interesting alternative to your standard DR set bonuses for specifically, I would say, Glaive Melee and Kinetic-focused ad clears. Specs-wise, these stats that you prioritize on any of these set bonuses is extremely situational, so I'm not going to go ahead and give any specific recommendation. Next up, we have Melee Survivability. My pick here is going to have to go to the Deepstone Crypt armor set called Legacy's Oath, which of course blinds enemies nearby when you get a powered melee kill, I believe. And then alternatives, you have Smoke Jumper, which pairs well because a lot of melee builds run triple heavy-handed. You get a lot of orb spam, allows you to have some very strong survivability. You have Tech Sec for glaive melee survivability, Swordmaster for glaive blocking survivability, as well as Praxic blocking survivability. You have Crota's Memory for chip splash damage on the 2-piece when you get a melee kill. And then you have Apostate's Blade, which can increase the amount of Scorch certain melee builds provide and make them a little bit more consistent. Now, stat-wise, of course, this is obviously still going to be situational, but a lot of the time you're going to be prioritizing 200 melee, so that may be something that you want to look into. Next, in our low priority group, we have Titan DPS. Now, I'm sure you may have heard, based on general community sentiment, that Titan is probably the worst DPS class in the game right now, and so this is going to end up being low priority if you're the type of player that can really pick any character for the given task. And so Curious of the Falling Star is going to be my pick for generic Titan damage, because it's just you put it on, you have a good damage super in the form of Thunder Crash. You can farm this from Rahul, of course. And then alternatives wise, we're looking at Hallowfire Heart, which allows Titan access to a strong solar sustain damage super. You have Armamentarium for collective action sort of damage rotations. You have Hazardous Propulsion, which can be paired with Turncoat in order to increase the little volley of missiles you create from your thruster, as well as give you an increase to, for example, rocket damage when you're solo, 35%. You can use it in fire teams as well, but of course you have probably Boots of the Assembler if you're in a fire team. And then Doomfang Pauldron for Sentinel Shield strategies. And finally, the Path of Burning Steps, which is a bit interesting, can increase your weapon and ignition damage, I believe, beyond what is typically considered normal. And so the Path of Burning Steps, maybe I'll create some sort of damage strategy to take advantage of this effect with Roaring Flames, but typically not that relevant when it comes to endgame damage scenarios, which is why it's at the bottom of the list. And then specs wise, you're typically looking for Powerhouse plus class on almost any sort of endgame DPS loadout. Coming up next, we have the standard 1-2 punch shotgun. Melee builds with 1-2 punch are not as common anymore. You certainly can use 1-2 punch with them, but a lot of people just melee these days. Perfect Paradox is pretty good, which you can get as a world drop. You can focus it, I believe. You can attune it. You have alternatives in the form of Basso Ostinato, which is an energy slot option with nanotech tracer missiles. You have threat level with double damage perks, but no reload assist in the form of Cast No Shadows. You have the Deicide, which is an energy slot option with Fail Deadly, which offers you a little bit more quality of life when it comes to keeping your mag topped up. You have Ikelos SG, which is kind of a worse Basso option, but it is an option. You have One Small Step, which also has Grave 1-2 Punch, but in my opinion is just worse than Perfect Paradox in the same slot. Specs-wise, you're looking at Pugilist, maybe Stopping Power, and one of the threat perks, plus 1-2 Punch or Trench Barrel on Perfect Paradox. Next up, we have an Ad Clear Rocket. Ad Clear Rockets are in theory very strong with the current artifacts, even though maybe not a lot of people are super willing to use them, given that a lot of people are into ability spam these days. But just objectively speaking, still pretty strong. Bellowing Giant is going to be my pick due to its access to Air Trigger and Bipod, as well as a strong origin trait from Arena Ops. But alternatives, you have Apex Predator, which combines Chain and Bipod, the When and Where, which has Frame of Reference, Pyroclastic Flow, which has access to Fail Deadly, Hesitant Vengeance, which has Time Lost Magazine, and Haliatus, which has access to Bray Legacy. Specs-wise, like I mentioned, you're looking at either Air Trigger or Overflow plus Bipod, and then potentially some reload assistance from the rest of your roll. Next up, we have DPS Drum GLs. Now, Drum GLs have fallen off pretty heavily. Edge Transit is going to be the strongest currently available option from Onslaught. Alternatives, you have VS Chill Inhibitor from Vesper's Host, featuring Cascade Point and Bray Legacy. You have the Ever Present, which offers you Envious plus standard damage perks, Craxus' Distress, which has pretty much the same things, and then Love and Death is an interesting option, has some pretty strong damage perks, and the reason why I mentioned this is because compressed waveframes actually do higher DPS than standard GLs if you're able to actually bounce the projectile off the target and get some impact numbers, as well as have the wave still damage the target. And so Love and Death could potentially be an option there. Unfortunately, Drum GLs, Heavy GLs, they're not very good in the current sandbox, even with this in mind, but I thought I would mention Love and Death for that funny little interaction. If you are going to farm for an Edge Transit though, for burst 1 mag DPS, you're looking for Sticky Grenades, which I'm not sure the new version rolls, or Spike, and then Cascade and Explosive Light or Honing. If you're not able to get Sticky Grenades on the current version, then VS Chill Inhibitor is also totally fine as well. Coming up next, we have DPS Swords, which are arguably maybe a little bit more relevant. The best one is going to be Bequest from the Deepstone Crypt for general damage use cases, but of course, I would be remiss to not mention certain alternatives like Striker's Surehand with redirection. Aggressive swords are very, very good at utilizing redirection because of their low ticks per swing compared to something like an Adaptive on Bequest. You have Sinancia, which is a wave sword, pretty decent archetype with access to tenacity.
You have Sullen Claw, which is an easy no setup option, no kills required, anything like that. You can just run Vorpal Whirlwind or Vorpal Bait and go to town. And then you have Ergo Sum, which is by default pretty decent, even with no sort of Dawn Chorus setup or anything weird, and just being on Prismatic and popping Transcendence. Competes with some of the top DPS legendary swords, and then once you add Dawn Chorus and Caster Polaris to the mix, it takes it to a whole nother level. And of course, when it comes to DPS swords, we have the other sustained exotics that we mentioned in some of the previous slides, and that is of course going to be stuff like Acreus, Lament, and Wolfsbane, which to be honest with you are a little bit worse than legendary swords in their current state, but maybe require a little bit less setup, maybe have a little bit more total damage, or maybe a little bit more survivability. Specs wise on Bequest, you're going to be looking at Jagged Edge and Relentless Strikes, potentially Jolting Feedback in the first column as well, and then Honing or Surrounded in the second column. Next up, for Fast Death, this is only really relevant in maybe certain challenge content or maybe in speedrunning, if you want to be able to die very quickly when a wipe is called, or maybe in order to get rid of a buff or something like that. You have Pure Recollection from the Tenet of Bravery. Featuring ricochet rounds, this double fire / heavy burst shotgun is able to one-shot you if you aim at the right place on a wall and damage yourself with both parts of the shotgun shot. Alternatives, you can use Ganora's Axe. This will not one-shot you, but it will get you pretty low. And so you can use Ganora's Axe as a safe option to get yourself very low, maybe to proc like the Fountain of Orbs effect from the Grasp set bonus. That's also an option, but Ganora's Axe is never going to typically accidentally end up killing you, whereas Pure Recollection might if you don't, sprint cancel the second half of the burst. Specs-wise, you're looking for ricochet rounds. I would say Withering Gaze is high utility on this thing too, but you don't really need it. And then high handling is obviously helpful for a weapon like this that is very singular in purpose. Next up, we have Precision Roam. So this is specifically for content where maybe you need to shoot crits, maybe you need to shoot arms, something like that, shoot some sort of precision objective and have a lot of total damage while doing it. The Helmsman is perfect for this from Crucible. Alternatives include Conspiracy Honed, which has lower total but higher DPS if you need follow-up shots. New Land Beyond basically does the exact same thing, but it's in the kinetic slot. If we had a legendary kinetic high impact sniper, I'd easily recommend that over New Land Beyond, but because New Land Beyond is the only option in the kinetic slot, I suppose I'll recommend it there with a little asterisk. And then specs wise, you're looking at Tactical Mag, Discord, or Light Touch in the first column, pretty bad first column. And then in the second column, you're looking at Honing or Gear Shift or Vorpal with a preference for a shiny sniper, so you have access to accelerated assault, but not super necessary given how you typically tend to use this sniper. Coming up next, we have the Kinetic Area Denial frame, and my top pick for this one is going to be Ouster Engine from Pinnacle Ops. Some alternatives include Festival Flight, which has Slice, which is excellent with artifact mods this season. We have Lost Signal, which has a great origin trait in the form of Radiolaria Transposer. Specs-wise for Ouster Engine, though, you're going to be looking at Air Trigger or Auto-Loading Holster or Rhyme Stealer or Blast Distributor in the first column, as well as Chain Reaction or Aggregate or Crystalline or Chaos in the second column, as well as preferably a shiny origin trait to have a free damage boost. Although other origin traits on this Area Denial are certainly not bad either, like Problem Solver and Vanguard Determination. And yes, that's a lot of perks to recommend, but all of them do have potentially some use in endgame content. Next up, we have the Energy Area Denial frame, and the recommendation here is of course going to be VS Velocity Baton from Vesper's Host. The alternatives here are going to be Psychopomp, which is potentially more relevant for DPS due to heretical behavior, and Motif 41 just because it's solar. Specs-wise on Baton, you're looking at Repulsor, Demo, Unrelenting, Dimensional, or Envious in the first column, as well as Destave, Chain, Attrition, Honing, and Bait in the second column. Bray Legacy is excellent on this Area Denial as well, but of course you're guaranteed to get that. Next up, we have Kinetic Legendary Primary. My recommendation here is going to be a little loose. Of course, it's going to strongly depend on your content and preference, but by default, I think Modified B7 Pistol is the strongest Kinetic Legendary Primary in the game from Territorial Prophet, the Spider Quest that I mentioned earlier. Alternatives obviously include Multimach CCX for high quality of life and attrition orbs, Submission, which has access to Kinetic Tremors, Chaos Reshaped, and Soul Drinker, Scathelock, which has the very strong Veteran's Wisdom origin trait, as well as additional range compared to some of the other options listed so far, M17 Fast Talker, which has Crystalline Corpse Bloom, as well as Attrition Orbs, and then finally Imminence, which has Slice, in an artifact set which has a lot of support for strand debuffed enemies. Specs-wise on the B7, you're looking at Firefly plus Headstone or Crystalline, great pairing with something like the Coda set bonus, and of course the shiny preference is going to be included here because Accelerated Assault is generally more preferred over something like Air-Cooled Core. Next up, we have Energy Legendary Primaries, and my recommendation here, again, is going to be loose once more. It's going to be Compact Defender from Territorial Prophet, but plenty of alternatives here. You have Reckless Oracle, which is heavily supported by Artifact Auto mods. You have Ironwood 03 for that raw damage profile of the Spread Shot Hand Cannon, Bug Out Bag for fast Attrition Orbs access, Kindled Orchid because it is Forge's Kin, and if you like 140 hand cannons, Horde of Crota for a non-spread shot hand cannon option with Cursed Thrall, Brass Attacks has Land Tank, and of course Unforgiven has Attrition Orbs and Chaos Reshaped if you're able to get the Void Overshield effect as well as destabilizing rounds from the artifact. Specs-wise for Compact Defender, the only real options here are going to be Destabilizing and Repulsor. The other perks on this weapon are pretty terrible, and then you have a shiny preference as well because Accelerated Assault, like I mentioned, is definitely going to be better than Air-Cooled Core. Next up on our low priority list, we have kinetic support autos, and my choice here is going to be Adamantite, but specifically the old Adamantite that you can get from Xur. And the reason for this is because if you're going to be using a support auto in the kinetic slot, oftentimes it's going to be for a specific reason to take off an energy support auto. And the specific reason for Adamantite would be Slice. Slice is a great way of applying Sever to something like a boss or even just enemies in general. Very strong perk to have on a weapon this season. If we're talking about the new Adamantite, the tier 5able one that doesn't have Slice and only has access to Reciprocity and Attrition, and I suppose it also has Physic, then I wouldn't really recommend Adamantite over Decatur 02. This is specifically referring to the old version which has access to Slice. Now, Decatur 02 is very strong with its Physic access to Frost Armor, which now decays one stack at a time, so definitely can be very helpful. Also, Decatur is just generally a pretty strong weapon in its perk pool compared to Adamantite in my opinion, so certainly both of these are very, very strong. Adamantite I'm just slightly favoring because for the support auto role specifically in optimized play, access to Slice for, applying an aggregate stack to the boss or something like that is potentially a little bit higher utility than getting something like Frost Armor from Physic Decatur. Coming up next, we have energy support autos, and it's no surprise that it's no hesitation that's the top pick from the Pale Heart here. Some alternatives include Cusp Sempiternal, which gives you Void Overshield instead, and also has access to Withering Gaze. We have Chrysera Mellow here, which offers Amplified, which is not as good of an effect, and only lasts for 5 seconds from what I know. And then specs-wise, on no hesitation, pretty obviously you're looking at Physic or Burning Ambition, plus Chaos Reshaped, Attrition Orbs, or Incandescent. And of course, not to mention that no hesitation also gets Dealer's Choice as well. Next up, we have Withering Gaze primaries for extending something like a Tractor or Fellwinter debuff. My number one pick here is going to be Vouchsave. Vouchsave comes from the Dreaming City. It's a lightweight scout that has high handling and also has access to Shoot to Loot, but there's certainly some alternatives that are pretty good as well. You have Cusp Sempiternal, which also is a support auto at the same time. You have Aisha's Embrace with a higher fire rate. You have Joxer's Longsword, which is a pulse, I suppose, with Shoot to Loot as well. And specs-wise, you're just looking for Shoot to Loot, Withering, and Handling on this weapon. Next up, we have Withering Gaze specials. Now, the optimal pick here is going to be Lotus Eater from Pinnacle Ops because it is a splash weapon, has good ammo economy. It has a couple perks in the left column that might be of high utility for a Withering Gaze weapon as well, but there are certainly plenty of alternatives. Glacioclasm and Monody 44, because their long charge time doesn't actually count as part of the firing window requirement for Withering Gaze, you can feel free to pull out a Glacioclasm, wait a little bit, and start charging the gun, and by the time the gun is fully charged, your Withering Gaze will activate, which allows you to waste less of that time for potential damage coming from Withering Gaze. You also have VS Gravitic Arrest, which is, while it is a worse frame for Withering Gaze compared to Glacio or Monody, has access to Bray Legacy and Attrition Orbs, which will very, very slowly make you an orb, as well as give you a little bit of ability gen. Wilderflight is an explosive option, so for certain enemy types where having explosive damage apply Withering Gaze can be useful, for example Golgoroth, that's something that's maybe worth noting. You have Pure Recollection, which is maybe a more comfortable option than some of the other options on this list for a melee pick that's hit scan. And then finally, you have Father's Sins, which applies Exhaust through Psycho Hack. You also have Shoot to Loot on this weapon as well. So pretty strong utility package there, even though I do think some of the other weapon types here are more suited to Withering Gaze in terms of quality of life. When it comes to Lotus Eater, the specs are going to be Reconstruction or maybe Light Touch, obviously Shoot to Loot if you have the old version, plus Withering Gaze and as much handling as you can manage. Next up, we have ammo generating weapons. Now, obviously, the top pick here is going to be Alethanim because it doesn't actually require any kills. You can just embed it into a target. I believe you can get this from the exotic kiosk. And then alternatives are going to include Icebreaker in the energy slot, which provides you with some ammo, no heavy, but obviously in return has a completely different set of mechanics when it comes to generating ammo. The next slide we're going to talk about is exotic kinetic primaries. The top pick for endgame content is, of course, Kvostov 7G0X, which you can get from an exotic quest. Alternatives include, though, Necrochasm, which has better spree and chaining potential if you can get crit kills, Osteostriga, which is a lazy option, Huckleberry for ammo gen, although you can argue that Kvostov is maybe better for ammo gen, and then Final Warning, which has a high damage profile and is strand if you want some sort of artifact support for strand weapons. Next up, we have exotic DOT/tick heavies. The best one here is going to be Anarchy, but of course you may want to use Finality's Augur if you're using some sort of solar special weapons. These are largely not relevant in endgame content these days with the current damage sandbox, but I thought I'd throw them into the low priority category because I don't think they fall truly into the niche category, not just quite yet. Anarchy obviously costs 240 spoils from the Monument to Lost Lights, if I'm not mistaken, and then Finality's Augur comes from Sundered Doctrine. Finally, we have our last category, which is going to be niche weapons. First up, we have Add Clear LMGs, and my pick is going to be Corrective Measure from Vault of Glass, but much like the legendary primaries, very, very flexible on this pick here. There's plenty of very, very good machine guns in this game right now. So you have Hammerhead, for example, with Forge's Kin and double damage perks, Song of Iryut with Cursed Thrall, Promemoria with access to Dealer's Choice, Bane of Sora with Elliptical Orbit and double damage perks, Diabloret's 06, which is a very, very strong strand option if you want to use a strand build. Commemoration also is the only machine gun in the game, to my knowledge, with Repulsor Brace. Specs on the Corrective Measure are going to be Demo, Destabilizing, Redirection, Firefly, and Dimensional, plus Tally or Demoralize or One for All. Very, very strong machine gun. Unfortunately, machine guns right now, generally speaking, in roam content, you're either going to be on a sword or maybe like an exotic heavy or like an exotic primary or something like that. LMGs unfortunately kind of struggle to find a proper niche in a lot of endgame players' loadouts. In damage encounters, you're going to be using your heavy for damage, and then in stuff like Conquest or Roam, LMGs don't offer you any mobility, and their minor DPS is relatively high, but not as high as some of the more nuclear options we have in the sandbox, and so that's why I put them into the niche category. Next up, we have blinding GLs. Yeah, not a lot of content in this game requires you to blind enemies anymore, but if there was a GL that I had to pick, it would be Lingering Dread from Duality, which has, of course, access to bipod. Some alternatives in other slots include Wilderflight with autoloading holster, Liturgy with slideways and chill clip, Malicious Birthright with Lead from Gold autoloading, Ignition Code with access to slide shot, and finally Pardon Our Dust with regular autoloading. For Lingering Dread, like I mentioned, specs-wise, you're going to be looking at autoloading/bipod and maybe some chill clip as well, and as much handling as you can manage. Next up, we have Collective Demolition, which is an interesting damage strategy that has arisen in recent times, and the number one pick here is going to be Chivalric Fire because it enables some interesting solo strategies with grenade damage that would otherwise not be possible, so it's kind of fitting, I suppose, that it comes from solo ops. Alternatives, though, you have some special options in the form of Cartesian, Techian, and Tahoma 01, because they're fusions with high hit counts. They're very potent with specifically Collective Demolition. You also have Hezen Vengeance, which has access to Collective Demolition plus damage perks. So if you have Galley, which offers you plenty of rocket hits that count for Collective Demolition, then you don't need to run something like Cluster Bomb. Cluster Bomb, on the other hand, is available on Apex Predator with Collective Demolition. If you are solo and you want those hits to come from just the rocket itself with no sort of exotic assistance. If you're going to run Chivalric Fire, though, specs-wise, you're looking for Collective plus maybe Collective, so Collective Demolition plus Collective Action. But you can also run Attrition Orbs or Eager Edge as well, which are plenty good for utility, whether you're running around in an encounter or trying to get orbs for like surges or anything similar. Coming up next, we have Compressed Waveframes, and the best one here is probably going to be Love and Death from the Moon, and this is because of its expansive access to pretty high level damage perks. However, the alternatives here are arguably better for ammo. Dimensional Hypotrichoid and Hullabaloo both have access to field prep and better origin traits. Specs-wise on Love and Death, you're going to be looking at Cascade, Envious, Impromptu, or Incandescent in the first column, and Aggregate, Bait, or Chain in the second column. But of course, this is a pretty niche pick, so you don't really need to farm for this. But if you were going to, then these are the perks that you would be looking at. Next up, we have DPS Breach GLs, and of course the best one is going to be Gizmo Weft from the Tenet of Bravery, just because it's a micro missile with access to stuff like Envious and Aggregate, but some alternatives include Wilderflight, which is a slightly worse frame as a double fire, but has similar perks for void swaps. You have Salvager Salvo with Trickle Charge spam and like Gear Shift using Bolt Charge barricades, and you have Liturgy for Icebreaker swaps in order to freeze a target every other rotation. And then for Gizmo West specifically, like I mentioned, you want Spike Grenades, Envious Arsenal, and Aggregate, Honing, or Bait. Next up, we have DPS Linears. DPS Linears are unfortunately pretty niche. They're outclassed by a lot of exotic heavies as well as legendary heavies. But if you want a solo option for Particle for like a very specific use case, I would take Eyes Unveiled as easily the best DPS Linear from Pit of Heresy. Alternatives include Cataclysmic, which is just strictly a downgrade, I would say, as well as Taipan, although Taipan is also just strictly a downgrade. It's also void, so there's basically no reason to put this here. I kind of just put it there because, I don't know, I guess I thought Cataclysmic was a little lonely. But specs-wise on this thing, you're looking for 4 times a charm or Mega Kill Clip. plus honing or sword logic. And I mentioned sword logic because, I don't know, maybe there's some opportunity if you're going to be stacking mega kill clip anyway. Maybe there's some encounter where there's like a boss that you can kill before damage, and you can have a significant bump over honing times 5 at 50% damage increase. But typically that's not going to happen. I can't even think of a single encounter where that exists, but I thought that would be funny to mention as an option over elemental honing. Next up in our niche category, we have energy DPS snipers, and my top pick here is going to be Omniscient Eye due to solar snipers being slightly favored because of incendiary rifle rounds. This is obtainable from Garden of Salvation and is also craftable. And then alternatives, you're looking at Rapid Growth, which has essentially the same role, but it's an arc sniper for maybe Anarchy pairing. You have Embraced Identity, which has redirection, Adored, which is basically just a rapid growth alternative, and then finally Trophy Hunter, which is if you want to avoid Dump Sniper, this is probably the best one because of its access to Fail Deadly, although it is an aggressive sniper, so its damage profile will be slightly worse than its Solar and Arc equivalents. Specs-wise on Omniscient, you're just looking at 4 times a charm plus honing or potentially Precision Instrument, but yeah, very limited use cases for these snipers, but they're pretty decent rules regardless. Next up, we have Kinetic Shoot to Loot Special Weapon. The only one with explosive payload here is really going to be Volta Bracket, which is unfortunately an aggressive sniper from Neomuna. You have some alternatives in the form of Unsworn, which is a high fire rate. Defiance of Yasmin, Irkonji, and Alan05 are all snipers as well, but unfortunately they do not obviously have explosive payload. Specs-wise, you just want shoot to loot and explosive payload and handling on this thing, but there are very few cases where you would ever use Volta Bracket, to be honest with you, for this, and so that's why it's in the niche category. Coming up next, we have energy shoot-to-loot primaries. Now, shoot-to-loot explosive payload, hand cannons, and the like are pretty common in challenges, but typically you're pairing this with a strong energy slot, maybe exotic special, typically like Still Hunt. And so rotations where you're using an energy shoot-to-loot weapon, especially a primary and not a special, are actually quite rare. And so Kindled Orchid is an option. It has shoot-to-loot explosive payload from Arena Ops. You also have Vouchsafe, which I mentioned earlier, which also has shoot-to-loot explosive payload and not just Withering Gaze. And then you essentially have 4 scouts that all have shoot-to-loot explosive payload. Nature Reclaimed and Tarnished Metal are the same frame as Vouchsafe. And then Briar's Love and Sublimation are worse frames due to their lower fire rates. Specs-wise on Kindled Orchid, like I mentioned, it's just like your classic shoot-to-loot explosive payload hand cannon. You're just looking for those 2 perks as well as much handling as you can manage. Next up on our list, we have Kinetic Glaives. Refusal of the Call is going to be the best one here from Pit of Heresy because of its access to Slice, but it also has interesting perks outside of that as well. Alternatives, we have Rake Angle with Chill Clip, a classic pick. The reason why glaives are in the niche category, I don't think I really need to tell you, but their defensive utility doesn't tend to be that useful in a lot of endgame content, and their lack of offensive presence, unless you really build heavily into them, is generally not worth the cost analysis investment. Specs-wise on Refusal of the Call, of course you're looking at Slice, but you also have access to Close to Melee, Chain Reaction, Grave Robber, Demo in the first column, as well as Chaos Reshaped and Replenishing in the second column. Of course, next up we have Energy Glaives. Ecliptic Distaff is going to be my pick of the litter here, coming from Solo Ops. Alternatives though, you do have the Heron, which has that Nail Meat Hammer origin trait, which kind of pairs well, I suppose, with TechSec. You have Lubray's Ruin with Close to Melee and Chaos Reshaped. Judgment of Kelgarath with access to Demo Wellspring on that tier 2 level, so you get a lot of ability gen from those kills. You have Nezarek's Whisper with Extrovert, and finally the Enigma with Psycho Hack. Specs-wise on Ecliptic Distaff, you're looking at Repulsor, Disruption, Immovable, or Grave Robber, plus Chaos Reshaped, Close to Melee, Withering, which is interesting to have on a glaive, and Destabilizing, as well as maximizing shield duration. Next up, we have Kinetic Waveframes. Kinetic Waveframes, unfortunately, a little bit overshadowed by Area Denials and other ad clear options, but if I had to pick one, I pick New Pacific Epitaph for sure from Ghost of the Deep because of its access to a lot of really strong perks. Alternatives though, you have Permafrost, which has special access to Attrition Orbs. You have Tusk of the Boar, which has access to Slice. But specs-wise on NPE, which is going to be my top pick, we're going to go with Chain Reaction, Unrelenting, Air Trigger, Rhyme, or Demo in the first column, especially Chain Reaction. And then in the second column, you have Redirection, which pairs well with Chain Reaction, as well as Crystalline Corpse Bloom and Reaper's Tithe, which is an interesting perk to have on an ad clear weapon. If we ever got Reaper's Tithe on a better archetype, I think it would be more highlighted as an ad clear favorite from a lot of people. Next, we have Energy Waveframes, which of course Forbearance from Onslaught, the Brave version, is going to be my pick here. And the reason is this has access to Redirection and Chain, just like NPE. But before we get into that, some alternatives. You have Romantic Death with Repulsor Destabilizing and Tenacity. You have Forbearance from the Raid, which has access to Soul Drinker with a slightly worse perk pool in my opinion. And then you have Martyr's Retribution with Heal Clip. Specs on this thing, you're going to go Redirection or Air Trigger, Unrelenting, Demo in the first column, as well as Chain, Desperate, or Volt Shot in the second column, but I don't really recommend farming for it necessarily, just like everything else in the niche category. Maybe if you have some downtime and you really want the God rolls of everything, you could look for something like this. Next, we have exotic melee buffs, which come from things like Bastion and Navigator. Bastion you can get from the kiosk, and Navigator comes from Ghosts of the Deep. Unfortunately, Grapple Melee is in its worst state that it's been in the past couple years, and Bastion, while it does boost melee damage, and people have pointed it out to me for use with Song of Flame, I honestly think it's quite overrated for use with Song of Flame, but I certainly will do some testing to notify you guys if my opinion changes from some more in-depth testing. However, from what I know right now, exotic melee buffs are definitely not as useful as they used to be, and they're certainly quite niche if you do plan on using them for any sort of melee strategy. Next up, we have exotic energy primaries, and unfortunately, because they occupy a more useful slot that is often taken up by other more important weapons, they are going to fall into the niche category. However, if you do want to use them, I think Collective Obligation is pretty strong from Vow the Disciple, but of course the other alternatives here are very close in power. We have Graviton Lance for a bit more lethality for less debuffing, we have Vex Mythoclast which has insane single target damage, and then we have Skyburner's Oath for lazy ignition spreading builds. So, in summary, what do you need to get for endgame PvE in Destiny 2? I've summarized it into these 8 points. So first, you want some good legendary armor. I would recommend getting some KF armor, some Europa armor, maybe get some Vogue armor, as well as Spire the Watcher potentially for super optimized damage. General DR2 pieces are good as well, like SE, Smoke, and Ion Adapter. For exotic DPS, whatever class you're playing, Nighthawk Fortune's Favor is good on Hunter. For the other classes, you're looking at Sanguine and Boots, and probably Cuirass and Hallowfire. For exotic roam armor, this is super personal and situational. There's a ton of builds that can be played even at the ultimate/conquest level, so find something that scales into ultimate if you need it. Otherwise, you're choosing some roam armor that match your DPS loadout. For example, if you're on Well, you're not going to be using some sort of Arc Warlock exotic, so just match whatever you're going to be using for damage and find something that works for you. Consistent damage-wise, A499 is excellent for just easy damage, but you should also definitely look at exotic heavies like Leviathan's Breath if you're on Mobius Quiver, 1K, Still Hunt, and Truth. Conspiracy Honed is obviously still great for special DPS. For optimized damage, you're going to be looking at Hezen with a time loss preference for your rockets. You have a good shout for crossbow rotations. You may want to invest in high quality of life shoot to loot type weapons, whether they're primaries or whether they're specials for brick pickups during damage, and maybe some shotguns like threat level. For roam content, you want good rocket pulses for sure in both slots, maybe a solid exotic option, and maybe some rocket sidearms for edge cases and even traces. Add clear rocket is a question mark because it really depends on whether your team is willing to go all out with galley and rocket artifact mods when going into some sort of roam activity. Team play wise, debuff options including Tractor, Divinity, and Fafnir are still essentials, and buff options like Galahorn and the occasional Turncoat, Darcy, or Ergo may come into play when it comes to Fireteam DPS. And finally, for movement, you're going to be looking at Bipod Gizmo, maybe a Theodolite, a good lightweight and a Vortex Eager Sword, maybe Ergo with a compatible frame like a Vortex or Wave Arc Conductor option, as well as Hyperblade Praxic Blade. That's pretty much it. The Destiny sandbox is in a pretty interesting and I would say more diverse state than it has been on average for the last couple years. Lots of builds are relevant, lots of set bonuses to farm, lots of weapons are relevant, but really if you're trying to just clear endgame content and you don't really care about optimizing too much, it's not super strict what you need to run, but if you're interested in optimizing to the highest degree and really farming the best stuff, then hopefully this slideshow and presentation have been of some use to you. And so that's about it. Happy farming, everybody. I'm going to be doing ability testing and making probably an endgame damage meta update, perk origin trade tier list, as well as the damage rotation ranking at some point. And I'm excited to present those videos to you. But until then, I hope this shopping list is enough to tide you over. If you're curious and you want to see the spreadsheet version of the shopping list, it's going to be in the description in the tiering spreadsheet as usual. But I would honestly argue that this video has more detail and more nuance than that tiering spreadsheet has. And so you're probably, if you've watched this whole video, shout out to you, respect to you. But this video probably has more details than what you'll find there. And that's pretty much it, guys. You guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next video.